A lonely rancher's simple act of kindness toward two starving children was about to change everything. When Samuel Morrison gave bread to two silent boys on his Wyoming ranch, he never imagined that the next morning would bring 9 more desperate children to his doorstep, all calling him Father. What happened next challenged everything the community believed about family, belonging, and the power of human compassion. But when territorial authorities threatened to tear this unlikely family apart, Samuel would have to fight the legal battle of his life. Make sure to hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more incredible true stories of the American frontier, and ring that notification bell because this story will restore your faith in humanity. The autumn wind swept across the Wyoming plains with a bite that promised an early winter. Samuel Morrison pulled his weathered hat lower as he mended the fence line that separated his modest ranch from the endless expanse of prairie grass. At 53, his hands bore the calluses of 30 years working this unforgiving land, and his graying beard couldn't hide the lines etched by solitude and loss. The ranch had been quiet since Martha passed 3 winters ago. Too quiet. The only sounds were the lowing of his small herd and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods near the creek. Samuel had grown accustomed to the silence, even found comfort in it, but today something felt different. He straightened, scanning the horizon with eyes trained to spot trouble, whether it came in the form of wolves, rustlers, or storms brewing in the distance. That's when he saw them. 2 small figures moving slowly across his land, dark shapes against the golden grass. Children. Samuel's grip tightened on the fence post. Children meant families, and families meant the kind of complications he'd been avoiding since Martha's death. But as the figures drew closer, he could see something was wrong. They moved with the careful, deliberate steps of the exhausted, and even from a distance, he could tell they were alone. The boys, for he could see now they were boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, approached with their hands visible and empty. Their clothes were little more than rags, patch and repatch until the original fabric was barely recognizable. Dirt streaked their faces, but it was their eyes that struck Samuel most. Old eyes and young faces, eyes that had seen too much. Afternoon, Samuel said carefully, setting down his tools. "You boys lost?" The older boy stepped slightly in front of the younger one, a protective gesture that spoke of experience with strangers. Neither spoke, but their eyes fixed on the tin lunch pail sitting on Samuel's fence post. Samuel followed their gaze and understood immediately. "You hungry?" The slightest nod from the older boy. Samuel reached for his lunch pail, withdrawing 2 thick slices of bread Martha's recipe had taught him to make. The bread was hearty, dark with molasses, the kind that could fill an empty stomach. He held it out, and after a moment's hesitation, the older boy crept forward to take it. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "What are your names?" Samuel asked gently. "Thomas," the older boy said after sharing the bread with his companion. "This is Billy." We don't got nowhere to go." Samuel studied their faces, noting the hollow cheeks and the way they devoured the bread despite obvious efforts to eat slowly. "Where'd you come from?" "Railroad camp, sir. About 10 miles north. Camp's gone now? Everyone's gone." Samuel knew about the railroad camps, temporary settlements that sprang up like mushrooms along the expanding rail lines, then disappeared just as quickly when the work moved on. Children in such places often fell through the cracks, especially when disease struck or parents simply abandoned them for better prospects elsewhere. "Your folks? Mama died of the fever last month," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "Papa, he left before that." The simple statement hit Samuel harder than he'd expected. He glanced toward his small cabin, its single window glowing warmly in the afternoon light. He'd been planning to spend the evening alone as usual, reading by lamplight and listening to the fire crackle in the stone hearth Martha had loved so much. "Tell you what," Samuel said, making a decision that surprised even him. "Night's coming on cold. You boys can bed down in my barn tonight. I'll rustle up some proper supper." Thomas's eyes widened. "You mean it, sir." "I mean it. Come on." As they walked toward the ranch buildings, Samuel noticed how the boys stayed close together and how Thomas kept one protective hand on Billy's shoulder. At the barn, Samuel showed them where they could make beds in the hayloft, warm and dry above the horses. "I'll bring supper out in a bit," he promised. Inside his cabin, Samuel prepared a pot of stew from dried beef and vegetables from Martha's garden. As it simmered, he found himself setting 3 bowls on the rough wooden table instead of 1. When was the last time he'd cooked for others? When was the last time voices had filled this space? He carried the meal to the barn along with a lantern, finding the boys huddled together in the hay. They ate with the careful gratitude of those who'd known real hunger, cleaning their bowls thoroughly and thanking him repeatedly. "Sleep well," Samuel told them. "We'll figure things out in the morning." As he walked back to the cabin under a canopy of stars, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the weight of responsibility for others. It was frightening and oddly comforting at the same time. He settled into his chair by the fire with a cup of coffee, trying to plan what to do with 2 orphan boys. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was 20 miles away, and the territorial authorities weren't known for their care of abandoned children. Most likely, the boys would end up in some grim institution back east if they were lucky. Samuel stared into the flames, remembering his own childhood on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, remembering the loneliness of these prairie winters, remembering Martha's quiet sadness when they'd learned they'd never have children of their own. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin eaves, and Samuel Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his custom, to the sound of voices outside his cabin, not just Thomas and Billy's voices, but others, many others. He pulled on his boots and jacket, stepping into the gray pre-dawn light to find a sight that stopped him cold. 11 children stood in his yard, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 14. Thomas and Billy were among them, but the others were strangers, thin, ragged children with the same hollow-eyed look of abandonment. They huddled together in the morning chill, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Thomas," Samuel said carefully, "what's this about?" The older boy stepped forward, his chin raised with a defiance that couldn't quite hide his fear. "These are the others, sir. From the camps in the town. They got nowhere neither." A girl of perhaps 12, with tangled brown hair and a dress that had seen better days, spoke up. "Thomas said you gave them food and shelter. Said you were kind." Samuel's eyes moved over the group, taking in each face. A boy with a pronounced limp leaning on a makeshift crutch. Twin girls who couldn't be more than 6, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. A sullen-looking teenager with angry eyes and crossed arms. Each child bore the marks of hardship, too thin bodies, patched clothing, and that particular weariness that came from being disappointed by adults too many times. "We don't mean no trouble," Thomas continued. "But we heard you was good folk. We thought, maybe—" The words hung in the air, unfinished but clear enough. Samuel felt the weight of 11 pairs of eyes on him, each gaze containing a mixture of hope and the expectation of rejection. His throat felt tight. "I'm just one man," he said quietly. "I've got a small ranch, barely enough to keep myself going." The children's faces began to fall, and Samuel saw some of them step backward, ready to turn away. But something in their expressions, the resignation, the return of that hard-earned indifference to disappointment, made him stop. "But," he continued, and saw their eyes brighten again, "winter's coming. None of you should be out in it alone." He looked at his small cabin, mentally calculating space and resources. It would be tight, impossibly tight, but people had survived worse with less. "My name's Samuel Morrison," he said formally. "This is my ranch. If you're going to stay even temporarily, there'll be rules. Everyone works according to their ability. Everyone contributes. And everyone treats everyone else with respect. Can you manage that?" A chorus of "yes, sir" rose from the group, voices overlapping in their eagerness. "All right, then," Samuel said, surprising himself with his calm tone. "Let's get you all fed and figure out the details." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Samuel discovered that the children had some basic supplies, blankets, a few cooking pots, and the kind of resourcefulness that came from necessity. The older ones had been caring for the younger, and their organization impressed him. Sarah, the 12-year-old who'd spoken first, emerged as a natural leader among the girls. She had been helping care for the twins, Emma and Elizabeth, since their mother died of cholera 2 months ago. Michael, the teenager with the angry expression, turned out to be 15 and possessed of a sharp intelligence that he used to mask his fear. Peter, the boy with the limp, had injured his leg in a mill accident and been turned out when he could no longer work. The other children, James, Mary, Ruth, and Young Danny each had their own story of loss and abandonment, tales that were heartbreakingly common in the rough territories where survival often took precedence over compassion. As Samuel distributed bowls of porridge and watched the children eat, he found himself studying their faces. When was the last time any of them had felt safe? When had they last been allowed to simply be children instead of survivors? "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said hesitantly, "we don't want to be trouble. We can work for our keep. All of us can do something useful." "I believe you," Samuel replied. "But first things first, we need to get you all properly housed before the cold sets in for real." He surveyed his property with new eyes. The cabin could maybe hold 4 or 5 people if they didn't mind being crowded. The barn was warm, but not suitable for long-term human habitation. He'd need to build, and fast. "Michael," he called to the teenager, "you know anything about construction?" The boy's angry mask slipped slightly, revealing surprise. "Some, sir. Worked on buildings in the railroad camps." "Good. Thomas, Sarah, you seem to be the ones the others listen to. Think you can organize work groups?" As the day progressed, Samuel found himself dividing the children into teams. The older ones would help with construction and heavy chores, while the younger ones could tend to lighter tasks like gathering kindling and helping with meals. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a start. By evening, they'd managed to clear a space behind the cabin where they could build a larger structure. Samuel had enough lumber stored in his barn to make a good start, and he made mental notes about what else they'd need from town. As they all gathered around a large fire for dinner, a stew made from one of Samuel's chickens and vegetables from Martha's garden, he looked around the circle of faces lit by the flickering flames. The children were talking quietly among themselves, their voices mixing with the crackle of burning wood and the distant lowing of cattle. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel's evening wasn't marked by silence. "Mr. Morrison," young Danny said suddenly, his voice clear in the night air, "are you going to be our pa now?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Samuel felt every eye turned to him, and the weight of their collective hope was almost overwhelming. "I know about that, son," he said carefully. "But I'll tell you this, you're all welcome here as long as you need to be." Danny nodded solemnly, then leaned against Sarah's shoulder. Around the fire, Samuel saw some of the tension leave the children's faces. Not all of it. Trust would take time, but enough that they could rest easier tonight. As the fire burned lower and the children began to settle into their makeshift beds in the barn, Thomas approached Samuel. "Sir," the boy said quietly, "why are you doing this? We ain't nothing to you." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the last flames dance among the coals. "Maybe because you reminded me that being nothing to someone doesn't mean you're worth nothing at all." Thomas nodded gravely, as if this made perfect sense to his young mind. "Good night, Paul," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, Mr. Morrison." "Good night, Thomas," Samuel replied, and didn't correct the slip. As he sat alone by the dying fire, Samuel Morrison realized that his quiet life had ended the moment 2 silent boys had looked at his lunch, pale with hungry eyes. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to the peaceful solitude he'd cultivated since Martha's death. And for the first time in years, that didn't frighten him. The sound of hammering filled the crisp morning air as Samuel and the older children worked to frame the new building. 3 weeks had passed since that morning when 11 children had appeared in his yard, and Samuel had learned more about himself in those weeks than the previous 3 years combined. "Hold that board steady, Michael," Samuel called, adjusting his grip on the heavy beam they were lifting into place. The boy had proven himself invaluable, strong for his age and possessed of a practical intelligence that made up for his lack of formal education. "Like this, Mr. Morrison?" Michael asked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. "Perfect. Thomas, hand me those nails." The building taking shape behind Samuel's cabin was larger than he'd originally planned, a long, rectangular structure that would serve as both dormitory and common room for the children. Sarah had suggested separate areas for boys and girls, with a central space where they could gather for meals and evening activities. Samuel had to admit the girl had a gift for organization that rivaled any Army quartermaster. She'd established schedules for cooking, cleaning, and childcare that kept the younger ones occupied while the older children worked on construction. Under her guidance, the twins Emma and Elizabeth had become expert gatherers of kindling, while 7-year-old Mary helped tend a small garden that would provide vegetables for winter storage. "Pa!" young Danny called out, then immediately clapped his hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with worry. Samuel paused in his hammering. The children had begun calling him Pa more frequently over the past week, despite his gentle corrections. He'd stopped trying to discourage it when he realized that the formal Mr. Morrison was creating a distance that none of them really wanted. "What is it, son?" Samuel asked, and saw Danny's face light up at the casual acceptance of the relationship. "There's riders coming. 3 of them." Samuel set down his hammer and stepped around the building to look toward the road. Sure enough, 3 men on horseback were approaching at a steady pace. His stomach tightened as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Jake Coleman from Cedar Falls. "Children," Samuel called calmly, "why don't you all go inside for a bit? Sarah, maybe you could start preparing some coffee for our guests." The children scattered quickly, but Samuel noticed several faces pressed against the cabin windows. They learned wearing this the hard way, these young ones, and unexpected visitors rarely brought good news to people in their position. Sheriff Coleman was a decent man, but he was also a man who followed territorial law to the letter. Behind him rode 2 men Samuel didn't recognize. One wore a suit despite the rough country, and the other had the bearing of a federal marshal. "Afternoon, Samuel," Sheriff Coleman called as the trio approached. "Heard you've had some changes out here." "Sheriff," Samuel replied evenly. "Gentlemen, what brings you to my ranch?" The man in the suit dismounted first. He was perhaps 40, with the soft hands of someone who worked with papers rather than tools. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Gerald Whitman from the Territorial Child Welfare Office. This is Marshal Roberts from the Federal District." Samuel's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "What can I do for you?" "We've received reports that you're harboring a significant number of minor children without proper legal guardianship," Whitman continued, consulting a small notebook. 11 children, to be precise, ranging in age from 5 to 15 years. "They needed shelter," Samuel said simply. "Winter's coming." "I understand your charitable impulses, Mr. Morrison," Whitman said in a tone that suggested he understood nothing of the sort. "But there are proper procedures for dealing with abandoned children. Institutions equipped to handle their care and education." "What kind of institutions?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The Territorial Boys' Home in Cheyenne has space for the male children. The girls will be sent to the Sisters of Mercy facility in Denver. They'll receive proper Christian education and training in useful trades." Samuel had heard about such places. Grim, overcrowded buildings where children were treated more like prisoners than young people in need of care. The useful trades typically meant factory work or domestic service that barely paid enough to cover room and board. And if I refused to turn them over... Marshal Roberts spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Then we'll have to take them by force, Mr. Morrison. You're not their legal guardian, and you have no right to keep them here." Samuel glanced toward the cabin window, seeing the frightened faces of the children who had begun to trust him. 3 weeks wasn't long enough to create legal family bonds, but it had been long enough for these young ones to start believing in safety again. "The children are well cared for," Samuel said carefully. "They're fed, clothed, and contributing to their own support through work appropriate to their ages. They're learning useful skills and receiving moral guidance." "That's not the point," Whitman replied impatiently. "You're a single man with no experience in child-rearing. These children need proper supervision and education." "What they need," Samuel said, his voice harder now, "is not to be ripped away from the first stable home most of them have ever known." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Samuel, I know your heart's in the right place, but the law's the law. These gentlemen have jurisdiction here." Samuel looked at the 3 men, then at the building behind him where Michael and Thomas had been working so hard, then at the cabin where Sarah was probably comforting the younger children who'd heard every word of this conversation. "How long do I have?" he asked. "We'll be back in 1 week," Whitman said. "That should give you time to prepare the children and gather their belongings." As the 3 men rode away, Samuel stood alone in his yard, feeling the weight of 11 young lives pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, he heard the cabin door creak open and small footsteps approaching. "Pa?" Thomas's voice was carefully controlled, but Samuel could hear the fear underneath. "Are they going to take us away?" Samuel turned to find all 11 children standing in a group, their faces reflecting the same mixture of terror and resignation he'd seen that first morning. Sarah held the twins' hands while Michael stood with his arms crossed. his angry mask firmly back in place. "I don't know," Samuel said honestly, "but I'm going to do everything I can to keep this family together." "Family?" Sarah asked quietly. Samuel looked at each face in turn, at Thomas's protective stance, at Michael's defiant anger, at the twins' wide-eyed trust, at young Danny's trembling lip. These children had become more to him than charity cases or temporary responsibilities. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks they'd become what Martha had always wanted their small cabin to hold. "Yes," he said firmly. "Family, and families fight for each other." As the children gathered around him in the October afternoon, Samuel Morrison began to plan the fight of his life. The week passed with desperate speed and feverish activity. Samuel had sent Michael into Cedar Falls to post letters to every lawyer within 100 miles, while Sarah worked with the other children to document their living conditions and daily routines. They all knew their time was running out, but no one spoke of what would happen if they failed. On the morning of the 6th day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Samuel watched from the barn as a single rider approached, a woman in a practical riding outfit, her graying hair pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Mr. Morrison?" she called as she dismounted. "I'm Catherine Wells. I received your letter." Samuel's heart leaped. Catherine Wells was a lawyer from Cheyenne, one of the few female attorneys in the territory. Her reputation for fighting lost causes was legendary, though Samuel had never expected her to respond to his desperate plea for help. "Mrs. Wells," he said, striding forward to take her horse's reins, "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you came." "Save your gratitude until we see if I can actually help," she replied briskly. "Now, where are these children I've heard about?" Over the next few hours, Catherine Wells interviewed each child separately, documenting their stories and taking careful notes about their living conditions. Samuel watched nervously as she examined the new building, the children's sleeping areas, and the small schoolroom Sarah had established in one corner of the cabin. "Impressive," she murmured as Sarah explained the daily schedule she created. "You've essentially established a functioning household in 3 weeks." "Sarah's the one who organized most of it," Samuel said. "These children have been taking care of themselves longer than anyone should have to." Catherine nodded, making more notes. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Are you prepared to take legal responsibility for 11 children? Formal adoption proceedings, financial obligation, everything that comes with being a legal parent?" Samuel had been asking himself the same question for days. The answer should have terrified him. He was a widower with a modest ranch and no experience raising children. But as he looked around at the life they built together in such a short time, he realized he'd already made his choice. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." The next morning, Sheriff Coleman returned with Whitman and Marshal Roberts, along with 2 additional men in a large wagon clearly intended to transport the children. Samuel met them in his yard, Catherine Wells at his side. "Mr. Morrison," Whitman said impatiently, "I trust you have the children ready for transport." "Actually," Catherine said, stepping forward with a folder of papers, "Mr. Morrison has filed formal adoption petitions for all 11 children in territorial court. As their legal counsel, I'm serving you with an injunction preventing their removal pending a full hearing." Whitman's face turned red. "This is preposterous. A single man cannot adopt 11 children." "Territorial law says otherwise," Catherine replied calmly. "Mr. Morrison has provided evidence of stable housing, adequate financial resources, and proper care. The children have stated their desire to remain in his custody. A hearing is scheduled for next month." Marshal Roberts looked at the papers, his expression grim. "These children were found in destitute circumstances. They're wards of the territory. They were found by Mr. Morrison, who provided them shelter and care when no one else would," Catherine shot back. "The territory had no interest in their welfare until he demonstrated that abandoned children could be successfully cared for by private citizens." Samuel watched the exchange with growing hope. Catherine Wells was every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested, and she'd clearly done her homework on territorial law. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, "I have affidavits from several residents of Cedar Falls testifying to Mr. Morrison's character and the children's well-being. I also have statements from each child expressing their desire to remain here." During the heated discussion that followed, Samuel noticed movement behind him. The children had emerged from the cabin and were standing in a group, watching the proceedings with solemn attention. Thomas and Sarah flanked the group like young guardians, while Michael stood with his jaw set in stubborn determination. "Pa," Danny said clearly, his small voice cutting through the adults' argument. "Are they going to take us away from home?" The word home seemed to hang in the air with particular weight. Samuel saw something shift in Sheriff Coleman's expression, and even Whitman appeared to hesitate. "This is their home," Samuel said quietly, addressing all the men but looking directly at Danny. "They've made it their home, and I've made them my family. That means something." Catherine seized a moment. "Gentlemen, as you can see, these children are well cared for, properly housed, and clearly happy. Mr. Morrison has done more for them in 1 month than the territorial authorities have done in years. I suggest you allow the legal process to proceed rather than traumatizing 11 young people who have already suffered enough upheaval in their lives." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Whitman consulting quietly with the marshal. Finally, Sheriff Coleman spoke up. "Mrs. Wells is right about the legal process," he said reluctantly. "If proper papers have been filed, we have to respect the injunction until the hearing." Whitman looked furious, but the marshal nodded in agreement. 1 month, he said to Samuel. "But if the court rules against you, these children will be removed immediately." As the officials rode away, Samuel felt a collective sigh of relief from the children behind him. But Catherine's expression remained serious. "This is just the beginning," she warned. "The hearing will be formal, and they'll challenge every aspect of your fitness as a guardian. We need to be prepared." Over the following weeks, Samuel and the children worked harder than ever to demonstrate their stability as a family unit. They completed the new building, established a formal school schedule, and documented every aspect of their daily lives. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, won over by the children's polite behavior during trips to town, provided character references. The hearing, when it finally came, was held in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. Samuel sat with Catherine at one table while Whitman and a territorial prosecutor occupied another. Behind them, the children sat in a neat row, dressed in their best clothes and displaying the kind of respectful attention that impressed everyone present. The proceedings lasted 3 days. Whitman argued that a single man couldn't properly supervise 11 children, that the ranch was too isolated for proper education, and that the territorial institutions were better equipped to prepare the children for productive adult lives. Catherine countered with testimony from teachers who'd examined the children and found them well educated, from doctors who'd certified their health, and from community members who testified to their good behavior and Samuel's character. Most powerfully, she called each child to testify about their living conditions and their wishes for the future. When young Danny took the stand and clearly stated that he wanted to stay with Paul Samuel and his brothers and sisters, even the territorial prosecutor looked uncomfortable. The judge's decision, when it came, was unequivocal. While unconventional, he said, the evidence clearly shows that these children are thriving under Mr. Morrison's care. The territorial facilities, while well-intentioned, cannot provide the individual attention and family environment these young people have found at the Morrison Ranch. The adoption petitions are approved. The celebration that night around the ranch fire was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. 11 children, his children now legally and officially, laughed and talked and planned for a future that suddenly seemed secure. Sarah had organized a special dinner, and even Michael smiled as he helped tend the fire. "Pa," Thomas said as the evening wound down, "what made you decide to keep us all that first day?" Samuel looked around the circle of faces lit by firelight, each one precious and unique, each one home. "I think," he said slowly, "you all reminded me that the best families aren't always the ones you're born into. Sometimes they're the ones you choose." As the children settled into their beds in the completed building behind the cabin, Samuel stood in his doorway looking out at the ranch that no longer seemed too quiet. The sound of young voices saying good night, the rustle of 11 children settling down to sleep safely, these were the sounds of home. 3 years ago, Samuel Morrison had been a widower alone on a failing ranch. Tonight, he was the father of 11 children and the head of a family that would endure whatever challenges the frontier could offer. And as he closed the cabin door and prepared for sleep, Samuel Morrison smiled and whispered a quiet thank you to Martha, wherever she was, for teaching him that love multiplied is never divided.